Welcome to the China Desk Podcast, presented by the Federal Newswire, with your host, Steve Yates.
Welcome to the China Desk Podcast. I'm your host, Steve Yates, Senior Research Fellow for China and National Security at the Heritage Foundation. A reminder to our audience, for whom we are most grateful, viewers can watch the China Desk on YouTube or subscribe to hear all our interviews on Apple, Spotify, and most other podcast providers. We welcome you to check out our website and show archive at ChinaDeskPodcast.com. My guest today is Terrence Shen, an independent China analyst, journalist, and host of one of the most influential Mandarin language channels on YouTube, covering PRC politics and East Asian affairs. A University of Toronto and Chinese University of Hong Kong alumnus with deep roots in the region, Terrence went from a former pro-regime voice to a sharp critic of CCP propaganda and influence operations. Based in Toronto, he regularly advises on policy issues and helps bridge English and Chinese-speaking discussions on Taiwan, Indo-Pacific security, and U.S.-China competition. With that, Terrence, welcome to the China Desk. Let's jump in.
Thank you, Steve, for your kind introduction, and I'm honored to be here speaking with you today.
Well, it's definitely our pleasure. I've looked forward to today's conversation for a variety of reasons, not least of which because I have also followed some of your content, may or may not have recommended it to friends from time to time. But today we have an opportunity to get to know Terrence. And so, as I warned, as I say to every guest in our pre-show, we like the audience to get to know the human being before we get into the meat of the conversation. So maybe share when you were growing up, going through grade school or what have you, and someone was asking you, what do you think you want to be when you grow up? Did you say, I'm going to be an international podcaster?
I wanted to be an author, writing books when I was in the schools. I grew up in China, in Beijing, the capital of China. And I went to Canada for the education. But I always wondering about the what I was taught in the school, if it's the truth or not, because obviously the Chinese textbooks are brainwashing materials. And I found out that when I was studying in the University of Toronto, a lot of the facts are different from what I was taught in China. So I feel like I was cheated by the Chinese education system. And I was kind of furious about that. And they don't tell you the truth. So then I started to look deeper and study Chinese history, culture, and also the politics. And then I realized I need to tell more people about it and how they were brainwashed in China, and how to confront the propaganda today in China and also in the world.
Well, it seems to me you are one of those perfect examples that's somewhat like the allegory of the cave in Western culture, where you were in the darkness, you came out of the cave, you started to see shadows along the way, then you saw color, and you're out in the world, and oh my goodness, now I can't go back to seeing things the way I did before. And in a way, not everyone hears that going to university in Canada was the gateway to do that. It's good to hear that you were able to approach the sort of a truth that changed your outlook on things. Now, maybe because people might be curious, share how, as you were on that journey and discovery and new mission to go back and tell others about what, in your view, they were being told that was wrong, how was that received by friends and family?
After I graduated from the university, I decided to go back to China, to get a closer look at the real Chinese society. But at that time, people told me that maybe you can go to Hong Kong, where you have a freedom of speech and freedom of academics. So I got my master's degree in Hong Kong and worked as a journalist there. And at that time, Hong Kong is still a free society. And I was able to...
Which years were that?
It's around 2011. And it's around the time when Xi Jinping became the top leader. And I was there in Hong Kong to do researches and also investigations about the Chinese event, all the different events in China. And also, I remember one of the events is in Wuhan, rebellion, the village. And we went there in the night, and the village is surrounded by the army and the police officers. So we have to sneak in with the help from the villagers. And I was there in a room full of international reporters from all the big media outlets. And I was very excited I can be one of them to record history. So that was a very exciting moment for me. I know that I chose the right path. And but after a few years working in Hong Kong, I went back to Beijing. At the time, we still have a hope that China can grow keep growing and keep opening, and eventually it will become a democratic and open society. So I worked in Beijing for a couple of years in another industry, a fashion industry, which is totally irrelevant. But I experienced the downfall of the Chinese economy. I feel like all the people are frustrated, and they feel like the economy is not going into anywhere, and we have a really bad situation there. So many billionaires and millionaires I talked to when I was in Beijing, they all have like foreign passports ready to leave, and they send their kids to overseas. They don't have hope in Chinese economy and Chinese growth. So I know that it's time to leave. So I left China. I went back to Toronto, Canada. So when I was working in the fashion media industry, I was writing some articles, essays to make commentaries on Chinese current events. But my account was banned 3 times. So I couldn't write anything else. It's always banned.
Banned from fashion commentary?
No, the commentary is about the Chinese social issues.
Right.
Yeah, that's like a hobby, right?
Right.
But the account was banned 3 times in a row. So I have already tens of thousands followers on that WeChat platforms. But my accounts was banned, so I have to leave. So I feel like there's no hope in China, and I started my media platform in Canada on YouTube. So for last 7 years, I've been building audiences from overseas, and also the Chinese when they are using the VPNs to watch my YouTube channels. Yeah, and I have grown over 1 million subscribers worldwide.
That's a tremendous level of success. I mean, it obviously says that you are producing things in a way that people are interested in and want to follow. It shows also that there is a pretty high appetite inside China for things that, like you, everyone there knows the government does not want them thinking about, talking about, or sharing. And yet there, even with years and years of crackdowns on that, there's still a really strong appetite for that kind of content. To me, it sounds a lot like what I hear from people that are involved in the unofficial churches, where there's a really high demand for meaning in life outside of the party, and the party's fighting against that. You're talking about meaning in life, not in religion, but in other ways that is outside the party, and there's a huge appetite for that. I don't think international audiences get enough proof that there is this strong demand signal, but your program is definitely a data point that shows that. That's pretty important, I'd say.
It also shows that there are so many Chinese people really wanting the truth.
Absolutely.
They want to hear the realities around them, because even in one city, they don't know what's happening in the city because everything is censored. But in the outside, in Canada, we can even know what's happening in one of the cities, right? Because of the internet, we have a free flow of information that people are sending all the information out. They cannot send it to each other, but they can send out to us.
Well, there's so you say you are at year 7, which, if my powers of mathematics are correct, that means you started in 2019.
Right before the COVID.
I was going to say it's right before a really interesting meridian in time. But that sort of raises 2 questions. You alluded it to one we asked this of a lot of different guests of what are some of the factors that really shape your assessment of or way of seeing today's China. In some ways, Xi Jinping is a factor, whether he is similar to or different from his predecessors. Some people would say, no, the predecessors were just as bad. We just didn't see it as clearly. But at least in my humble estimation, Xi Jinping is a different kind of leader. I'd welcome your sense on that, how much of a factor Xi Jinping is as an individual leader. And the other is the meridian in time you were knocking on. 2019 is when COVID started. It got discovered worldwide in early 2020. But I would strongly suspect the COVID experience, the disruption, the lockdowns, some of the popular reactions to the government's management of that probably reinforced a lot of what you were just saying, friends and others were telling you about dissatisfaction and concern before that. But in the way you look at the direction China is going today, and maybe what some of your key concerns or complaints might be, how big a factor is Xi Jinping? How big a factor has COVID been in shaping what you think?
I think that what happened in China during the COVID reminds us of Tiananmen Square massacre. It shows that this regime is reluctant to take care of its own people, but they put their own interest above everything else. So they want stability. That's the only thing they care about for their own survival. Because if there's no stability, they will lose their power, and then everybody in the top will probably going to be prosecuted. So they really want to keep their power. So during the COVID and also the Tiananmen massacre, we saw them doing all these strategies to oppress people, and I think the COVID doesn't really surprise me. And I think that's what the CCP should be doing, because we know it's so well. They've been killing people, they've been imprisoning the lawyers and journalists, and they of course will lock in your home, right? So it doesn't really surprise me at that point. But I just feel like I should not be there staying in China at that time, because I will be the victim because of this Chinese system. It's not only the Xi Jinping, what Xi Jinping is doing. If you just imagine if it's Hu Jintao or Jiang Zemin during the COVID, he will probably do the same thing.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's an interesting thesis, because we don't often have that in our public discourse, but even among policy specialists and those that are in China studies, there's sort of an assumption that all these leaders are the same, and you just sort of see different manifestations as the collective party leadership adjusts to different circumstances, or you have kind of the dominant leader thesis. And so Deng Xiaoping was very, very different. And so there was reform and opening and a kind of a different approach during some of those years. Hu Jintao, largely a boring guy. And then you end up with a Xi Jinping. And we've had some pretty dramatic changes under Xi Jinping. And the question is it him or is it the system? It sounds to me like you're more on the side of it's the system. And I don't think there's a right or wrong answer to this 100%, but I'm curious of your leanings on this.
I was joking about the Xi Jinping people, because everybody is criticizing Xi Jinping. But sometimes I say, who kills most people, more people, like Deng Xiaoping or Xi Jinping? Of course, Deng Xiaoping killed more people, right? But we think that Deng Xiaoping opened up China's economy, right? Integrate China into the world system. It's like looks like a better guy, but no, he killed more people, right? So it's just at a different stage of the development. They make strategic decisions. It's just Xi Jinping. He's now not lucky. He became the leader of the China at this stage. So he has to do those things to keep the power, to save the save the party.
Well, I appreciate you doing some of these sort of background and deeper questions to get the conversation going. But let's dive in a little bit about your program. So a lot of the content that you are working with is pretty direct stuff, some of it pretty critical, and it's edgier than you'd hear in most of the Washington policy circles, I'd give just as an example. But how do you decide about how far to push different narratives when I assume you have a very sizable Chinese-speaking audience, and maybe those lines or barriers or customs and norms are different than we might perceive in just the English-speaking media and social media?
Mm-hmm. I started to make English commentaries on X like a couple years ago. I started doing that. And when Elon Musk liked one of my tweets a couple weeks ago, I know I was on the good right path, right?
What was the subject that you caught his eye with?
Yeah, I was joking about some people plays the risk card when people criticize the Chinese researchers and experts stealing technology from US. Yeah, and they said, oh, this racism. I said it's nothing about the race. It's about who is criminal. So and Elon Musk like one of my tweets. Yeah, and anyway, it's also personal. My own family was persecuted by the Chinese Communist Party under Mao. My grandfather was imprisoned for 4 years simply because he was a police officer before 1949. When the CCP took over China that year, and anyone who works for the former government was persecuted. And my grandfather was one of them. And my family's property and assets were all confiscated. So these are the real things that actually happened to us. So it gives me a much clearer view of what the CCP really is. But when I analyze China, I was very cautious. I want to make sure that my analysis is based on facts. Every position I take is grounded in what I see as an honest reading of the reality, not emotional reaction. But ever since the Xi Jinping came to power, CCP has clearly started moving back towards centralized control. So it's gone from what people used to call soft authoritarianism towards something much closer to totalitarianism. And this shift has been happening right in front of us. So my level of criticism is really calibrated to how CCP actually governs. If they push harder on suppressing society, and then my criticism gets sharper. And if they had stayed on a real reform path, like the kind of gradual reforms we saw during the Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao era, I wouldn't see overthrowing the party as a necessary path either. So over these past few years, that role seems to have closed off.
Mm-hmm. Well, I appreciate you sharing the personal parts of it too, because all of us are human beings, and we do our best to cover what we see dispassionately, but it wouldn't be human if we completely ignored things that were witnessed by our family and loved ones and things we've seen ourselves. I think that adds to the richness of the conversation. Now, in some of what you cover, you're not just critiquing the CCP, you're also looking at deeper aspects of Chinese political culture. Some of it might be rooted in longer historical and cultural patterns. Maybe share a couple of examples of when you're looking at something that you see as unhealthy or wrong that needs to be talked about and addressed, that isn't just Xi Jinping bad or party bad. What are some of the examples of Chinese political culture that you think maybe mainstream Westerners wouldn't get that kind of matter to understanding China today?
This is a really big topic. I've always thought it's not actually that hard to understand the party itself, because we already have a model, which is the Soviet Union. China is essentially just another USSR, except with much more economic leverage, thanks to the globalization. But what I think the West hasn't really grasped is what made China become a communist regime in the first place, and what would actually happen if that regime collapsed. So that's why we have to look deeper into the political culture and traditions that go back thousands of years in Chinese history. That's really is my interest. So I've been reading a lot of books about the Chinese history to trying to understand China, modern China. Then I want to unpack a little bit if I have time here.
Yeah.
After Qing Empire fell in 1911, all the provinces all over the former Qing territory declared independence one after another. Right. Soon after, the World War I broke out, and the European empires dissolved as well, like the Ottoman Empire, Russia Empire, right? The Austro-Hungarian Empire, and different ethnic groups went on to build their own nation states in Europe. But mainland East Asia didn't follow that path. It's exceptional. Why? The nation states that could have emerged were essentially wiped out, largely because Soviet influence backed both the Chinese nationalists and the Chinese communists. One after another, they established the Republic of China and then the People's Republic of China. In both cases, the territory was effectively stitched back together to replace the old Qing Empire. Like the Manchuria and the East Turkestan are the perfect examples, both short-lived and quickly eliminated. So in other words, mainland East Asia might have fragmented the way Europe did. But because of the outside interference from Soviet Union, another large empire got merged back together. So when you look at the PRC today, suppressing Uyghurs, Tibetans, Mongolians, stripping Hong Kongers of their freedoms, and threatening to annex Taiwan, this is exactly the kind of a behavior you would expect from an empire trying to hold itself together. Mm-hmm. So and this precisely because of East Asia's agrarian civilization and its deep authoritarian political culture, that this kind of empire keeps reappearing in the region in the history. Mm-hmm. So I actually just made a mini documentary about Sun Yat-sen on my YouTube channel a few days ago. I talk about how his ambition to reunify China came into direct conflict with the local business interests and the local government in Guangdong. Mm-hmm. So what he ended up doing was sacrificing the safety, the freedom, and the business interest and the future of local people just to revive a great empire through violent revolutions. So when he couldn't pull it off on his own, he brought the communists in China from the Soviet Union, and the rest is history. Even the Republic of China he built was like destroyed by the CCP, right? So so that's why I find it very hard to believe that the PRC today will be able to pull off a successful democratic transition the way South Korea or Taiwan did. I think the most likely ending will still be disintegration.
Well, that is the dominant narrative of thousands of years of what people call Chinese history. I think we've had another guest, Bill Hayton, who's written a book about the invention of China that I think very accurately points out that what we call China, that's actually not a Chinese word. That concept comes from outsiders, and it's an effort by outsiders to find unity in a civilization that had factionalism and warring states and this sort of pulling apart more than pulling together over thousands of years, with some exceptions, with big empires, some of those empires being foreign empires, Mongols being a big example for hundreds of years. But let's go from cool history, which I love having talked about, and some of the deep roots, all the way back into present pop culture, because there's still some things that you've talked about in your program that I think help inform current and modern discourse about what's happening in China. And one of them is this lying flat phenomenon that came up in recent years. So to the uninitiated who don't always follow things China, they may not have heard of what this is, but a different kind of protest. But what is it, and what is it really communicating?
Thank you for watching my show, first of all. And the lying flag is like the people today, especially young people in China, feel like they are squeezed between the high living cost and also very heavy burden on them. So they naturally fall back and decide to lying flat and not having children, and spend a minimum expenses and just live a very simple life, right? So you can describe it as a collective form of a passive resistance to the economic reality, but also it's more like a forced choice driven by economic pressure and their basic survival instinct. We have to look at the Chinese history again. I'm sorry about that, because first of all, since the Qin dynasty, not Qin, Qin dynasty unified parts of mainland East Asia and built the first bureaucratic state. They call it the first dynasty of China. The governing logic has been fairly consistent. They use force to break apart local communities, atomize the system, the society, and concentrate all the resources in the hands of the state. Mm-hmm. So under this kind of absolute autocracy, anything with a sense of honor or any organized defense of local interest, including religious groups, gets treated as a threat and eliminated. After more than 2,000 years of this, mainland East Asia has gradually turned into what some describe as a loose sand society, essentially atomized individuals without strong social connections. So when the foreign capital dividends today started drying up in the recent years, the young people found themselves like they don't have any hope in the future. So this is the way they choose. But at the same time, it's very important to remember the CCP at its core is a Leninist party, right? So that kind of system is extremely expensive to maintain. It has to constantly suppress the civil society and extract resources to keep itself running. You remember the China's economic growth since 1978 has been built largely on integration into the global supply chain. Right? It's an export-driven model supported by a massive low-cost labor force. And to keep that model competitive, the labor cost cannot rise too quickly. So in the past, China has a huge surplus population. But now, with the demographic decline accelerating, the labor is starting to tighten. If a large number of college graduates refuse to enter factories or assembly lines, then the wages will rise and the entire supply chain starts to come under pressure. And the private company don't have the power to force people to work or keep the wages down. Only the state can do that. They do that through an institutional mechanism, like tracking those students early and directing them into vocational education, and whether they want it or not. So when you look at this way, the crackdown on lying flat is really about protecting the low-cost labor structure and maintaining the flow of foreign capital that the system depends on.
I think that's one of the better explanations I've heard to show how this entire cycle works together. It's super, super important. So let's pivot from the business and manufacturing, sort of that has been a really, really important part of the modern China story. In some of your content, you've also suggested that China's economic and military position may not be as strong as it appears. I happen to share that thesis, but I'd like to hear what you think the biggest vulnerabilities are on the economic and military position.
First of all, I want to say that the CCP runs a system that by its own very nature suppresses civil society's ability to organize and innovate on its own. So the regime has to mobilize the entire nation's resources to systematically take technology from the outside world, particularly from the US. So the economy and the military is the same thing. They have to rely on the foreign inputs to survive. So that's the vulnerability, I think, for China's for the development. And because China is a communist system, people always say, "Oh, China is a capitalist society; it's not a communist anymore." But if you look at the CCP, the structure, the strategy, the way of thinking, the power structure, is a communist system. It's always been a communist system, and definitely have no institutional conditions for innovation. Like for example, there's no rule of law. There's no independent civil society. There's no free flow of information, and there's no strong protection of private property. So I read a book called "Why Nations Fail." I bet everybody reads this. It's a very great book. Distinguishes between extractive and inclusive system. So I think the framework is quite useful and applies to China. Chinese system is clearly is extraction. How the system extraction works. So when the China's development has been heavily dependent on the foreign capital and the technology, then you know the vulnerability. The mechanism works like this. The state lifted restrictions on the internal labor mobility, allowed a massive rural to urban migration, and without providing any welfare, and plugged that displaced labor force into global manufacturing. And it basically treated cheap slave labor for capital and technology. And after several decades of this, China's economic and military capacities now has grown to a point where it can challenge the existing international order. But right now, the underlying conditions are changing. Demographics are shifting, right? They don't have enough young people, to put them into the factories, and the labor costs are rising. Supply chains are already starting to relocate. So at the same time, the policy like manufacturing reshoring in the US are accelerating that process. So the system is facing pressure on multiple fronts at once. When it comes to the military, the pattern is similar. A significant portion of its technological base still depends on adapting Western dual-use technology, often acquired through indirect channels. So if you impose a real technology blockade and restrict those flows, both Chinese economy and the military are facing long-term structural limits.
Well, those are very, very important points, especially the concluding point, because too many analysts in international media and in academia consider the economic story and the military story as separate. And I think that they are inherently linked, as you described. So I hope the audience goes back and maybe listens again to that point, because I think it's a really, really good one to punctuate. We've got limited time and still a list of things.
I have another interesting point I want to make.
Go ahead.
Because I've been reading a lot of Chinese propaganda, right? Since I was a child. Now I've been reading this to study, but in the past I was being brainwashed. Now, since I've been reading all of this, I know that China today, after Xi Jinping took power, they have this so-called national rejuvenation of Chinese civilization. So this narrative is very interesting. They build this legitimacy now around this narrative, but historically they are being dependent on external inputs, as I said before, first from the Soviet Union and later from the West. Mm-hmm. So to sustain this narrative, the system tends to push towards expansion, even when the material capacity may not fully support it. So this kind of a mismatch, tend to end really badly, in the future.
Super important. One of the areas we haven't talked about yet, but I'm very curious about, is Taiwan. You've made a couple of allusions on some other parts of the Q&A, but when you talk to your audience about Taiwan-related issues, how do you think they perceive China's actions? Do they see China's recent pressures or engagements towards Taiwan as a sign of strength, as an indication of insecurity, or something else?
I have two groups of audience. One is overseas Chinese and Taiwanese. Taiwanese, actually around 30% of my audience is Taiwanese. And another group is the Chinese people living in China. Right? Yeah. So they are two different groups. And the Taiwanese and the overseas Chinese are, I think, my audience, they are well informed because they've been watching my shows. Yeah. And they understand clearly that China's action poses a direct threat to Taiwan's security and political freedom. But interestingly, their primary concern isn't always about military invasion. They are aware that Beijing is constrained by the possibility of US and Japanese involvement. So there is a level of deterrence in the place. What concerns them more, in many cases, is what's happening internally within Taiwan. So they pay close attention to domestic political actors like the opposition Kuomintang, KMT, how those actors engage with Beijing. The recent visit by the KMT leadership to China and a meeting with Xi Jinping have already raised concerns. At the same time, they are worried about obstruction of the arms purchase from US and the spread of pro-Beijing narratives in Taiwan, and also the broader political environment that could shape Taiwan's long-term trajectory. So from their perspective, the risk isn't just external pressure from China, it's also internal.
Well, that's a pretty shrewd analysis. And of course, the CCP, as you know, accentuates in attacking and trying to exacerbate internal divisions. It's one of its number one political warfare techniques, perfected inside China, of course, and now exported pretty widely. It's one of the, I think, the newest awakenings in a lot of our capitals. We've had the participants of IPAC on the program a couple of times, and I think there's a lot of capitals in the Western world, but also in some other geographies that feel these sort of political warfare pressure points in modern times, more than looking back on the history of things. That's an interesting, I think, new chapter in looking at the CCP versus just thinking of China as a faraway country that is the manufacturing platform for the world that we somewhat made. So we're coming up near the end of our time for today, but I want to leave time for you to give some parting thoughts. But before you get to your parting thoughts and telling people where they can listen to your programs and follow your commentary, I'm really curious to hear from your 7 years of doing your program, what are the topics that seem to trigger the strongest reactions or pushback from pro-CCP audiences? You've covered a lot of topics over a number of years. What are the hot ones for the pro-CCP audience?
I don't really have a large pro-CCP audience to begin with, right? But
you have to have some people that hate watch your program.
Right. Well, I do get pushback. It tends to come from people who feel that their worldview or identity is being challenged because they are victim of their the propaganda. And the topics like China's economic situation, or the arguments about the nature of U.S.-China competition tends to trigger stronger reactions. Yeah, they are living a dream that China is the strongest country in the world, and U.S. is so evil. And so when I talk about this in different perspectives, they feel like I'm a traitor, I'm a evil guy, or something like that. Yeah, they've been throwing names at me all the time.
Well, I am sure that they have called you all kinds of things, some of which might even fall under the accusation of racism.
Yes.
And that is another one of their favored political warfare tools. Mm-hmm. But on that happy note, Terrence, we really, really appreciate you joining us today. Before we part, please tell our audience where they should go to follow your program and your commentary.
Sure. My YouTube channel is in Mandarin, is公子沈. And my English commentaries on X is at Terrence Shen, my English name, TERENCESSHEN, Terrence Shen. Thank you so much.
Well, for our audience, if you've enjoyed today's China Desk conversation, please tell your friends, consider subscribing, and give a visit to ChinaDeskPodcast.com. I want to thank you for joining. A special thank you to Terrence Shen for sharing his perspective. Until next time, I'm Steve Yates, your host here at the China Desk.
Thank you for listening to the China Desk podcast, presented by the Federal Newswire and hosted by Steve Yates. Check out the Federal Newswire's family of websites, as well as their social media stream.